The following teaching is possible thanks to the friends and partners of Spirit and Truth Fellowship International.
Now we're looking at scriptures that show that God is love, and when He created His spirit world back before the earth as we know it was created, He created beings, spirit beings, with different levels of authority, different positions, so that some of them would help Him administer creation. And He's done that all through creation, and we'll continue that process and that pattern even out into the future. And we've been looking at the counsel of God. Now, in Daniel chapter 4, these counselors are called watchers. And the word watcher is unique to Daniel, but as we can see from reading the record, that these watchers are the same as God's inner counsel. And we know that. Now, this is about Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4. And Nebuchadnezzar, at one point in his life, was very filled with pride. And then he became insane for a period of time. And God revealed how this was going to work to him in a vision. And so in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is explaining this vision, this dream that he had to Daniel. And in chapter 4, verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar says, "I saw visions in my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven." Now, we've talked about mythology before, and Nebuchadnezzar would have already believed. He was a Babylonian. He would have already believed there was a council, some kind of council of gods, or a council that served a bigger god, like if Bel-Marduk was the top god, he would have a council. And so Nebuchadnezzar already believed there were like assisting spirits. And in Jewish mythology, interestingly enough, and that's one of the reasons we have to be careful of mythology, that the watchers are fallen angels. They aren't good angels, they are evil angels. But what we know from the Bible is the watchers are good angels. Here it says, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. And he proclaimed aloud and said, "Chop down the tree." Now the tree is Nebuchadnezzar. So this is talking about the fall of Nebuchadnezzar as he went into this period of insanity when he stopped being the king. And as we're talking about this time of insanity, the scripture goes on in 4:17, Daniel 4:17, to say, "The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones." So this council, if you will, that's assisting God in ruling His creation has made a decree, and they've made a decision. And it's a decision concerning Nebuchadnezzar, a human being on earth. But note what they say. Are they saying that we get to rule without God? No. The whole point of this was that the living may know the Most High rules the kingdom of men. So here's this council of spirit beings that's assisting God, and their purpose and their point is to help point to God, to magnify God, to glorify God. That's what any minister is supposed to do. Every single person in the church of God, but especially the ministers, especially God's appointed leaders, need to constantly bring people back to how great God is, how powerful God is, how wonderful God is. To bring people back that God is God. And then God, in His love and grace, has given Jesus Christ all authority in heaven and earth. So that Jesus Christ is God's viceroy, is God's under ruler, if you will, is administering creation, and then Jesus Christ appoints heads in the church. This is the pattern in the way God works. And so he says these watchers, these holy ones, have made a decision about Nebuchadnezzar. But did they make the decision on their own? No. Who heads up the council? God does. And God's the final voice and the final decision maker. And because of that, just a few verses later, after saying this is a decision, a decree of the watchers and a decision by the word of the holy ones, it goes on and it says, it's a decree of the Most High. Daniel 4:24, it's a decree of the Most High. You see, God is working with His counsel. He's not a tyrant. But the other side of the coin is he just doesn't hand over administration of the universe and have nothing to do with it. God's still the Most High. He's still the final word, the final authority. And it points that out in Daniel chapter 4. And so, beautiful picture here in Daniel 4 of God working with his creation to administer his creation, but still having the final word and being the one who is in final charge, final authority. Now we keep reading. That was Daniel chapter 4. We go to Daniel chapter 7, and we see God in a courtroom making decisions as a court. Now Daniel chapter 7 is the context of the empires of the earth that have arisen in time, and particularly empire that is going to be on the earth and dominating the earth in the last times. And there's a being in Daniel 7 called the little horn, who you and I know is the antichrist. And this little horn is speaking arrogantly, and he's messing around with God's timing, or trying to. And finally God's had enough. The end of time has come. The judgment is going to be set. The battle of Armageddon will occur. The antichrist will be judged. And so in Daniel chapter 7 verse 9 we read, "And as I looked," because here's Daniel, and he's getting this vision, this revelation of the end times and what's going on and all these horrible things the little horn is doing. And he says, "As I looked," I'm watching in my vision, "thrones were set in place." See, not just the throne, but thrones were set in place. This is God's court, the council that God works with to judge mankind. "And the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened." There's so much here. First of all, when it talks about the thousands and the 10,000s, they stood while he was seated. This is going to come up in just a little bit in Isaiah chapter 14. But the rulers sit and the people stand and watch. And this was very standard procedure in ancient courts. And we see it here in the scripture. And when it says the court was seated, and you can look this up in the Hebrew lexicons, the word court here that gets seated, it's a council of judges, a panel of judges. So God's court, God's judges that help him judge mankind are seated, absolutely. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 25 goes on. We read 9 and 10. This is 25. "He," this is the Antichrist, the little horn, "will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time." This is the last 3.5 years of what we call the Great Tribulation, or the Tribulation period. This is the Great Tribulation, the wrath of God, the last 3.5 years of the Tribulation period. And when it says saints here, it doesn't necessarily refer to Christians. In fact, in this case, it doesn't refer to Christians. It's simply the Hebrew word Holy One. And if you're a believer in the Tribulation period, you are a Holy One. You are just like in the Old Testament. If you were a believer like Abraham, you were a Holy One. We are holy too, Christians, but by virtue of our new birth. After we're raptured and the Antichrist, he's oppressing the holy ones, those who are left on earth, who have now come to believe. Absolutely. So he's doing that. And in verse 26, it says, "But the court will sit." And we saw that. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. His fire, his throne is ablaze. It's the time of judgment. The thrones are set up. The court's set up. The court will sit. Their decision, his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. So this is God working in concert with a heavenly court to judge in the final time. Absolutely. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 4, we see God surrounded by other thrones. And John writes in Revelation chapter 4, verse 2, "At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And we learn that just like in Daniel chapter 7, this is God. In John's vision, he sees God sitting on his throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. And around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Verse 24, around the throne of God, were 24 thrones. So it's not just God on a throne. There are 24 other thrones sitting and helping God administer his creation. And seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with gold crowns on their head. And we know that these elders are spirit being elders. They're not human being elders. And this is written about in a lot of different commentaries. I'll just pick one. This is E.W. Bullinger's commentary on the book of Revelation. And I'll just read some pieces out of it to you. I think it's very informative. Bullinger writes, these elders are the heads of the heavenly priesthood, the chief priests or elders of heavenly worship and rule. The comparative presbyteros, that's what it calls these guys, presbyteros, has been distinguished as marking and denoting official position. You see, these are rulers that are helping God administer his creation. In the papyri, it, meaning the word presbyteros, is constantly used of both civil and religious rulers. So these 24 elders are princely leaders, rulers and governors of heaven's worship. They are kings and priests. They were not and cannot be the church of God. They are already crowned when the throne is first set up. They were not and are not redeemed, for they distinguish between themselves and those who are redeemed. They are heavenly unfallen beings. And as, quote, elders, they are also rulers, and hence are seen seated on thrones. So yeah, these 24 elders, they're spirit being elders, and they administer God's creation. And interestingly enough, we look at Daniel and it's way back in the Old Testament. We look at Revelation, it's the last book of the New Testament. But time-wise, Daniel's speaking about the same time that John is seeing in his vision. The elders on the thrones in Daniel chapter 7, it doesn't say there were 24, we don't know how many there are, but they are at the same time period as the 24 elders in the book of Revelation. So close in time, in fact, that I would venture to say they are the same group. Absolutely. So in any case, these elders are spirit beings, and they help God administer his creation. And that's what we've seen in many other scriptures as well, and we will continue to see in this next segment.